As you know, we are concerned that our students are going to use AI to write for them. And so they won't be doing the reading and they won't be doing the critical thinking, and their writing will be poor quality. So I'm going to use task complexity theory to explore what GPT is good at and also not so good at. I'm going to use examples from Austen's Pride and Prejudice because it's a story that many of us know. And so it will be really obvious when something is not a very good piece of writing. I'm also using T's theme from 150 on food. So my thanks to T for some really entertaining conversation. So I'm going to go through only a few examples because task complexity is a really large system. At the same time, nobody can do all the things that I'm going to talk about today, but if it sparks a few ideas in people, then that will be success. And also, that said, I should again say that the ideas that I'm presenting in this talk will expire. This is inevitable because AI is developing rapidly. All right, so in the academic literature that is growing on ChatGPT and writing, there's a phrase called cognitive offloading. And this is the actions that people take to reduce the cognitive demands of a task. So we, as writing teachers, we need to know what parts of a task can GPT handle. And so that's good, and we can bring it into our classrooms. And then what parts of our writing task is GPT not good at yet? So then we can try to use this understanding to make sure that students are thinking and reading and engaging with the challenge of writing academically. So I began exploring this topic by using a prompt with GPT, which was simply, why did Elizabeth marry Mr. Darcy? And I got a huge number of prompts, many of which are quite funny. And the answers resemble poor student writing. So I'm just going to show you a few of these examples that I got from GPT. So GPT says, Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth and she accepts. Okay, so that misses out most of the book. And GPT says, Elizabeth recognizes that they are well matched, but the point of the book is exactly that they are not. GPT says her initial negative impression was based on misunderstandings. Yes, sort of, but he also really was rude and arrogant, and he made Mr. Bingley dump Jane. GPT provides a possible answer. She's fallen in love with Mr. Darcy, except they argue for most of the book, and you can't leave that out. GPT says she eventually falls in love with him and accepts his second proposal, but that glosses over almost everything that goes on. GPT offers they understand each other's strengths and weaknesses and are willing to work together to build a strong, happy marriage, but that is kind of repackaging events in psychobabble terminology, sort of, terms that don't fit. So then you get Elizabeth is moved by Mr. Darcy's heartfelt proposal of marriage in which he declares his love for her despite her lower social standing and the disapproval of his family. But that completely misses the complexity of Elizabeth's negative feelings and in an unthinking way produces the whole problem. If you love someone despite their social standing, there's a bit of an issue there. You get they have come to deeply love and respect each other despite the initial obstacles that stood in their way. So that's using plot instead of character. And then finally, you get an outright hallucination. She values his social status and financial security, which provide a comfortable and stable future for her and her family. All right, so all of the problems that you see in those kinds of answers, we already knew as writing teachers before GPT came along. You have to move beyond naive and easy answers. You have to include all the significant elements. You have to capture complexity. In good writing, for example, in Pride and Prejudice, if you're writing about that, there are definitely misunderstandings, but equally the point about Darcy and Elizabeth is that at some level, they really do understand each other. You need to apply sophisticated concepts. Good writing represents reality accurately. If you provide this kind of generalized account, this is inadequate. Good writing is incisive. You have to be able to offer insight at various levels, and you need to know the area well enough that you aren't making big mistakes. All right, so we knew all that already. Now that there's GPT in the world, one of the things that we need is task complexity to avoid students simply handing in all of the problems that they would probably hand in if they just wrote without thinking themselves. So there's this thing called the triadic componential framework, and this is the currently accepted cognitive science model of task complexity. And complex tasks require more effort to write about, and effort can be varied through the way you design the tasks. And there's these 6 components of varying the effort required. And the glue that kind of holds them together is causal reasoning. So we're going to look at a couple of these. So just terminology, here and now refers to writing about the situation that you are already in. The further you get from your own time and space, the harder it is to write. So if you write a recount looking past, or if you predict looking forward, if you get out of your own place and move into other cultures and contexts and so on, that takes more effort, that's more complex. The number of elements you include in a task increases the complexity. So if we consider a writing task like this one, explain the principles of veganism and explore how their adoption would impact farming in Kazakhstan, you can kind of represent this as the number of principles times the number of, elements or steps in the process. So let's say a student had 4 principles of veganism and they had 8 steps in how Kazakhstan farming could move over toward that. That becomes quite a complicated thing to write. Perspective taking, if you write your own opinion, that's the easiest because you know your opinion. But if you have to write in the voice of a community, that's harder. Trying to research and understand the opinions of persons or groups outside of your experience is harder. We looked last week at procedural tasks. The amount of new information that is required to complete the task is also an element that can make the task more complicated. But causal reasoning, which is the glue that holds all these things together, includes a large number of things. I'm going to talk about a few of them today. And they're central to task complexity. So that's information, kinds of causes, assumptions, and inferences. Can you hear me? I just got a funny little message. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're fine now, but there was a huge gap there for a second.
Okay, a huge gap or a small gap? Do you want me to go over something?
I'd say it was about a 10-second gap.
Ooh, okay. So all I said was that we talked about procedural tasks last time, so I'm not dealing with them this time. The amount of prior knowledge required to complete a task is one of the things that impacts the task complexity. And then the glue that holds all these things together is causal reasoning. Now, there are a large number of different factors that go into causal reasoning. Today, I'm only going to look at information, cause kinds, identifying assumptions, and making inferences. All right, so collecting information. So any task will have a certain level of information demand. So GPT is okay at doing this. You can ask GPT for basic information or even advanced information. Sometimes it makes mistakes. It's not actually better than the internet. We more or less assume that our students are going to go and look for information on the internet. So if they're doing this with GPT, it's not a whole lot different. So that's okay. Assumptions are a little more complicated. So for a very simple task involving assumptions, so a single element, no perspective taking, doesn't involve any steps, not much prior knowledge needed, GPT will usually be okay. It will usually be correct. However, it doesn't provide full information. So you can ask it, for example, who arranged Lydia and Wickham's marriage, and it will correctly tell you that the Bennett girls' uncle and aunt, the Gardners, did this. But equally, you can ask it, is Darcy responsible for Lydia and Wickham's marriage? And it will say yes. So it doesn't give you full information. Now, if you ask, what does Elizabeth assume about the meaning of Lydia's wedding for herself? Again, you get an accurate answer. Lydia's marriage to Wickham is going to have a negative impact on Elizabeth's prospects for marriage. But GPT does not provide information on those multiple factors, on the wider significance, unless you ask for that information. And if you know enough to ask, then you don't need to. So therefore, you're unlikely to need to get the text. GPT is not good with multiple causes. So if you have a situation that is complex and has many causes, that's a really complex task, one that students cannot easily use GPT to help them with. So this prompt, what different beliefs make Elizabeth and Jane disagree about seeing the good in the people? Elizabeth and Jane have this argument about whether or not Darcy's a good guy. From Jane's point of view, she accepts her responsibility as the eldest daughter. She has to get married to Darcy's friend Bingley, she hopes. because then she will make sure that she can look after her sisters and they can marry well. So her apparently sweet temper is influenced by her hope to marry Bingley. And she cannot acknowledge the merit in the allegations by Wickham that Darcy's a bad guy. But from the point of view of Elizabeth, who is second-born and a spikier personality, she resents being a dependent. She believes women are equal to men. She wants to do her own thing. And she is critical of Jane because she thinks it's not amiability of personality, it's pragmatism and fear. And she's kind of excited by hearing these allegations about Darcy from Wickham. So that's quite a complicated set of causes, and GPT is not good at identifying them. So if you ask this question to GPT, you get a single factor analysis based only on personality. And so you also get this very simplistic kind of seriality of causes or seriality of factors. So you have Jane's personality and then followed by Elizabeth's personality. And you miss out all of the very interesting real causes: class, gender, psychology, identity, and so on. GPT is capable of reading Austen's words and representing them, but is not capable of really seeing the meaning. And of course, GPT has completely missed the whole thing that Wickham has lied. So if we got this particular piece of writing in answer to that question, we would give the student the feedback that this is not a good piece of writing and it's not good critical thinking. So you can do this with other tasks as well. So imagine that a student is given the task, what beliefs do Kazakh people have about food safety? They would then need to go and look up on Google, on GPT or whatever, what is food safety and what's the situation in Kazakhstan? They would begin to break out communities and try to figure out what their assumptions were. Can you hear me? Oh, there we go. Okay, so they would break out assumptions and try to figure out what different communities thought and how to find out about public opinion. All right, so as I said, for information needs, GPT can give information, but it's not actually better than Google or other search engines, but it's much less good at assumptions and paradigms and perceptions and worldviews. So this is the answer that GPT gives to this question. So the question is, what beliefs do Kazakh people have about food safety? And you can see that this is completely inadequate. So it has very little information. It doesn't break out perspectives or communities or contexts. It doesn't involve any causality. It's highly generalized. So if we got this piece of writing in response to that, it might be grammatically correct, but we would still give the feedback, this is not a good piece of writing, this is not good critical thinking, it's information poor, and so on. Okay, so you may be wondering, what do we do if they break something down into small parts and ask GPT for text on those little bits of the task? All right, so if they do that, they will get a series of highly generalized texts with low-level content. And then they will have to try to put all of those little pieces of text together. And in doing so, they'll need to improve the information content, and they'll have to write the bridging material. And so in the end, they will probably end up doing the required work. Alternately, if they don't do the required work and they just present these serial pieces of text that GPT has given them, then when they hand this in, we'll give them the feedback, this is not a good piece of writing and doesn't show much critical thinking. All right, so inferencing is a major dimension of causality. If you have factors that simply vary together in lockstep, GPT is quite good at this. So simple single factor relationships are a place to start. Covariation, however, is not complex enough to require much effort. So if you ask GPT, how do the Bennett girls' ball experiences shape their understanding of character, it will tell you that it teaches them the importance of understanding motivations. Or if you ask it, how does vegetarianism reduce greenhouse gases? It will explain, that it reduces carbon footprint because it requires few resources, etc. Okay, that's fine. But then because this is a task that doesn't require much complexity, much effort, we should move toward more complexity. All right, so an example of more complexity is a time-order relationship. So this is where A leads to B. And for simple time order relationships, GPT is okay. So does Lydia running away with Wickham lead to the Bennett girls' disgrace? Yes. But if you look at multiple inferences or inferential chains, then GPT is not as good at it. So if you ask, does Lydia running away with Wickham lead to the Bennett girl's success in life? It will tell you no. But if you look at the entire chain of events, Lydia running away leads to Darcy intervening, leads to Elizabeth finding out that he intervened, leads to Elizabeth and Darcy getting married, leads to everybody being better off in life. Right? So that's a chain of events. So GPT, the thing about GPT is that it will answer only the question that the student asks. So it will get the answer, but unlike in talking to a human being about that story, if you ask that to a human being, they would explain all of those other events that lead in the end to Darcy and Elizabeth getting married. They would provide greater information because they understand significance, where GPT will just answer the question. All right, so GPT is often accurate but simplistic. This is because of the way GPT works. So it doesn't think in any way. It simply parses the words in the prompt. It identifies the content and the function words. It vectorizes it. It's got the syntax sorted. Then it goes and raids its 175 billion parameter database and generates likely content. So it cannot contextualize or attribute importance. So if you think about questions like these ones, does the affordability of prepackaged food items impact customer food product preferences? Yes. And then if you do this with meat, does the availability of packaged meat impact customer food preferences? Yes, but you can ask it the opposite way and still get yes. If you ask this for a human being, the human being would understand more about why we ask this question. So they would likely talk about climate change and ethical issues. But GPT will give you simply the accurate response most of the time, unless it's hallucinating, but stay much more at a trivial level. And so you're caught in that same ironic loop where to get better output, you have to give it better input, which means you have to read more and think more in order to write better prompts. So if people are reading more and thinking more and writing better prompts, all right, that's good. We have succeeded in doing what we want them to do. All right, so even more complicated is to eliminate plausible alternatives in order to identify a real meaning or explanation. So if you think about a question like, does Mary Bennett like reading? Oh, sorry, that should be, why does Mary Bennett like reading? The answer you get from GPT is that her personality is bookish and intellectual. GPT is not really very good at interpreting psychological or social realities. If you ask it to define psychological or sociological terminology, it can do that, but it has very little ability to see the purpose or the intent behind a question like this. So in the case of Mary Bennett, she's very understandably frightened of her reality. She has to get married or she'll be poor for the rest of her life, but she is overwhelmed by that reality and not able to cope with it, so she retreats into books. All right, so another very complicated task is positing theoretical models. So this is taking specific instances and trying to use them to build a general understanding. So if you ask a question like, why is Mr. Bennett so sarcastic? GPT will tell you that it's because he's not satisfied with his life or his marriage. This is not untrue, but again, it's not great for actual insight or evaluation. So it misses the fact that his passive-aggressive mocking of his wife has to do a lot of the time with Mrs. Bennett's own behavior, and it completely misses the whole relationship between Mr. Bennett and Elizabeth in sharing private jokes. So GPT is really not good at handling the difference between what is said and what is meant. So in linguistics, we call this pragmatics. In natural language processing, it's called context incongruity, false negatives, implicit sentiment. So there's a wonderful example. So when Darcy is talking about what he expects in any woman who could be his wife, he says, knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, the modern languages, and besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, and to all this, she must yet add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. So this is Darcy's shopping list for his wife, and Elizabeth responds, I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder at your knowing any. All right, so she's being sarcastic. And if you ask GPT, why does she say, I rather wonder at your knowing any, GPT will simply say that at this point in the novel, she is prejudiced against Darcy. All right, so a lot of the time, one of the things that is interesting and important about the way we communicate is that exactly what we say is not exactly what we mean. And we can use this in creating prompts. So prompts that encapsulate an insight or a positionality. For example, can we give up eating meat? And GPT will simply say, yes, this is possible. This is what a vegetarian diet is, and this is, and you can be healthy. All right, so that answer misses most of what the question means. Similarly, you can have a guiding metaphor in creating a task. So the one I gave GPT was, how does the food production industry steer us toward specific food preferences? And this uses the metaphor steer. And I got this absolutely hilarious piece of writing. Now, if a human being wrote this text, we would think they were trying to be intentionally funny. It's really terrible. But GPT will go with the metaphor at a really very obvious level. All right, so to sum up, what have we got here? If you ask simple tasks like, why did Elizabeth marry Darcy? You're going to get responses that resemble not so very good student writing. You can gain task complexity by using different times and places, cultures, contexts, settings. You can create task complexity by combining numbers of elements or numbers of steps. You can increase task complexity by asking students to write from various perspectives or in the voices of persons and communities. GPT is good for the initial stages of information collecting. It can do simple causality. It can do single step or single element assumptions and simple inferences, but it doesn't really do multiple causes. It doesn't have much psychological or social insight. It's not very good at providing the significance or the context at understanding why a question is asked. Doesn't do assumptions very well. It's nowheresville on pragmatics. That is to say, the difference between what we say and what we mean when we speak figuratively, when we speak metaphorically. And it's really not very good at eliminating alternatives or at time order relationships. So if students use it for these kinds of elements of a task, they're going to end up either doing the work to integrate the parts or not doing the work and getting feedback from us, which says, well, this is not very good work. We need you to, to do better than this. All right, so the things that we've been through today, nobody can do all of this, but I'm hoping that it might have sparked some ideas.